In a pivotal scene from the Polish film Polkot, the ethereal hymn that the choir boys sing blends into a cover of the song My Blood, Moja Krew. The church's altar is decorated with deer skulls, while the boys' English teacher, Janina, looks on. While the scene looks surreal, it's not too far removed from reality, as the words the priest recites are not fiction. They're a compilation of quotes author Olga Tokarczuk collected from actual sermons by real Catholic priests in Poland. In this conservative country, even being vegetarian or vegan is seen as something that challenges traditional values. Recently, Tokarczuk won the Nobel Prize for Literature for her novel, The Book of Jacob. As she's a feminist and vegetarian and not afraid to take on the Catholic Church, I think she's the kind of public figure conservative Poland desperately needs. On Facebook, I was liking my friend's post about her award when I saw this meme, and one of my lefty friends mentioned her dreadlocks. Then I saw a few people on Twitter post about her dreadlocks, not about her activism or her award, but about her dreads. Part 1. Oh no, we're talking about cultural appropriation. Again. I spent some time thinking about this, and I gotta defend her hair. Specifically, I like to talk a bit about Polish history and culture, though I promise not to talk about the Polish-Lithuaninan Commonwealth, which was a kingdom in Poland and Lithuania. If you're not familiar, cultural appropriation is when one culture adopts elements from another disadvantaged minority culture. Think white Victoria's Secret models wearing Native American headdresses. Personally, I think most of the time, cultural appropriation is a fairly low-stakes problem. I do have exceptions, like don't go in blackface, thanks Justin Trudeau, or by mass-produced dream catchers. You want a dream catcher? Buy from a native seller. I also don't think that using Native American tribes as mascots is cultural appropriation. It's just mockery. For example, this shirt formed by an intramural basketball team in Colorado would probably piss plenty of white Americans off. So, don't use people that were historically treated badly as your mascot, and don't use racial slurs as sports teams' nicknames. But what about dreadlocks? After this video went viral, with a woman confronting a white man over his dreadlocks, debate about this hairstyle went mainstream. It's a complicated one. While dreadlocks have been worn by many cultures over the centuries, from ancient Egyptians to Spartan fighters in ancient Greece to pre-Columbian Aztec priests, the modern style was popularized by Rastafarian culture in Jamaica. A big part of Rasta culture is the idea of living naturally, and not processing one's hair is part of that. And having dreads is a way to visually show one's participation in the movement. But I'm calling shenanigans on the argument about dreads in Rastafarian culture, not because they're not connected, but because black people aren't criticized the same way for having dreads, but not being Rastafarian. And I'm deeply uncomfortable with making race the standard for issues like this, but not culture or religion. To me, criticizing white people for having dreads is just trendy and lazy activism. Punks or others with mohawks aren't criticized in the same way, despite that being an example of a borrowed hairstyle to appear cool or edgy. Honestly, I find discourse around this issue a little pointless. If the argument divides leftists, confuses liberals, and alienates centrists. If the goal is to make society less racist, I don't see how having racial tests for certain hairstyles is going to further that goal. Considering how white America has treated black hair, both in regards to standards of beauty and professionalism, I totally get why Americans adopting a black hairstyle rubs people the wrong way. But Tokarczuk, the author in question, is Polish, not American. I don't think anyone could argue that Polish culture is somehow a majority culture, especially compared with African American culture. When I first started researching this video, I had to look for stuff written about dreadlocks and cultural appropriation in Polish. About a page in of Googling stuff about dready and przywłaszczenie kulturowe, I thought, why am I doing this? Why am I expecting Polish people to understand the United States history with racism in regards to hair? Tokarczuk is not the only lefty Polish person I know sporting dreads. Moreover, why am I expecting them to speak English? To me, this view is incredibly American-centric. Znalazłam artykuł na ten temat, na opisie. To give you an example of the problem with those types of expectations, here's a pop quiz. Can you find Poland on this map? No? That's because Poland isn't on this map, and I wasn't truthful. We are going to talk about the Polish-Lithuaninan Commonwealth, and the historical differences between Western and Central Europe. So why didn't Poland benefit from the age of imperialism? Let's look at some history for context. Part 2. Historical context. Poland was never part of the so-called Age of Exploration in the 1500s. Unlike Spain, Great Britain, or France, Poland never sent ships to the Americas for colonies. I'm not going to get into the reasons for the kingdom's decline, but decline it did. Until the country was divided in half, with Russia taking one side and Germany's Prussia taking the other. Poland stayed off the map for over 100 years. In fact, it was until the end of World War I that the partitioning and the occupation ended. But less than 20 years after that, Poland was invaded and occupied by the Nazis. After World War II, Poland spent almost 40 years under the draconian rule of the Soviet Union. When the country emerged from behind the Iron Curtain in 1989, they had some serious catching up to do. All the black market Levi's and rock cassette tapes wouldn't make up for the economic damage of Soviet-style communism, the mental toll of terror and surveillance by the citizens' militia, the Polish secret police, or the basic fact that, in terms of both infrastructure and culture, Poland was behind the times. While the country has heard the colonial narrative of Africans as others via Hollywood, and I do think Poles have a responsibility to examine their literature and films with a critical eye, Poland has never benefited from imperialism the same way that certain Western European countries have. That's why I don't think it makes any sense to hold Poles accountable for the evils caused by colonialism or imperialism. And therefore, I don't think it makes sense to treat dreadlocks in Poland the same way as in America. Few people here know or understand the significance hair has had for African Americans, and I'm not sure it's fair to expect Poles to know, unless you think my history of Poland's past 300 years was overly simplified, and you want to offer a nuanced critique. But I don't think that's very many people watching. Also, if you're judging Poles by the same standard as Americans, because Poles are white, I have some bad news. You're making the same logistical mistake that white supremacists make, believing there is a white race. There is no such thing as the white race. That idea is a social construct made up by racists. I don't see the value in putting Polish people in the same basket as Americans, or Western European countries that participated in colonialism. Just because Poles are Caucasian doesn't mean they're responsible for knowing what the history of race relations in the U.S. I suppose you could make the argument that by adopting dreadlocks, Poles should understand the history behind the hairstyle. However, if that history belongs to Rastafarians, doesn't that let Poles off the hook for understanding the issue of hair and racism in the U.S.? While researching this video, I found Tokarczuk's own explanation for the dreadlocks, and now to the Polish plate, or plica polonica, which dates to the 17th century. At first, I was a little skeptical because I'd heard people justifying white dreadlocks by pointing to the Vikings. But I found there is a historical tradition for this style, even though it's called Kołtun in Polish and not dready. Again, I think people are more inspired by dreadlocks than this museum exhibit. On the other hand, with her knowledge of Polish culture, I'm giving her the benefit of the doubt. A big reason I'm giving her a pass is the extent to which Polish culture was suppressed under the partition. Yet the poem Pan Tadeusz by Adam Mickiewicz is beloved in part because it described Polish culture at a time when Poland was occupied by both Russia and German Prussia. The Polish plate dates from the 1600s and seems to become until the 1800s, when Poland was still off the map. When a country has been occupied the way Poland has, it makes sense that they look back to history to rediscover possible lost traditions. Not that I'm letting Poland or Central Europe off the hook for issues about race. There are real issues involving race and nationality in Poland that need to be addressed. Part 3. Marzynek Bambo, or oh wow, that's racist. So we're going to skip over the centuries of anti-Semitism in Poland because that would take too long and it isn't just a Polish issue. Same thing with how the Roma have been treated. To me, these issues are a problem for many European countries and are not specific to Central Europe. Right now, Poland is undergoing a rise in nationalism. Angry men screaming Poland for Poles have become standard at Poland's Independence Day marches. I tried to leave my home on Independence Day. This year, the racist nationalists refused to disperse when ordered by police, and the marchers had water cannons used on them. Disclaimer, the nationalists in Poland are anti-Semitic, but they're also anti-immigrant, anti-gay, and anti-European Union. When the Syrian refugee crisis was at its peak, Poland refused to allow any Muslims to settle there, emboldening countries like Hungary and the Czech Republic to do the same thing. Rooted in this was the idea that Muslims are inherently violent, unlike Polish people who never throw Molotov cocktails through windows or get arrested for making bombs. Sure, you can accuse me of cherry picking these examples, and most Poles don't do the things mentioned in these articles. I would counter the vast majority of Muslims don't commit terrorism. Painting Muslims as violent or gays as pedophiles is a common tactic with the current ruling party, Prawo i Sprawiedliwość, Truth and Justice in English. I think this type of state-sponsored bigotry is atrocious, as PIS controls what TVN, the country's largest TV station, broadcasts. I think the right-wing media in Poland is literally poisoning people's minds. Poland's stance on immigrants is extremely hypocritical. While refusing to help Syrians, the country has seen a large influx of Ukrainians. While Ukrainians do experience some harassment, like these stickers in Ukrainian that had a razor blade embedded in them, it's nothing like what Middle Easterners face. This is because, in addition to being white, the Polish and Ukrainian languages are really similar, so they can assimilate more quickly. So, say you cannot deal with the awfulness of politics and you want to analyze pop culture instead? Then forget dreadlocks. I've seen some super off-putting images and representations of black people in Poland. Like Palma butter, which has this African woman with exaggerated lips on the label. Or these cakes. I'm not going to say what these are actually called because, well, oh fine. They're called the N-word followed by a slang term for breasts. And I'm certain that Poles realize how bad this looks. This bilingual website with traditional cakes doesn't have a recipe for this cake in English. On YouTube, this Polish woman posted a how-to titled The Cake with a Controversial Name. Not just racism in the grocery store. Once while trying to explain the Native American mascot issue to a class, a Polish student brought up the poem Marzenek Bambo, a poem about an African boy. So written in 1923 by a Polish Jew, it's a fairly short poem intended for children, but the end lines have him not wanting to take a bath for fear he'll turn white. And I'm going to quote this Polish woman who wrote a letter to the editor. While she likes the poem, the ending made her uncomfortable. While I'm talking about the ways Poles view race, I should mention the outcry on Reddit over the Witcher casting call involving Ciri. It was leaked that Netflix was looking for a BAME actress, or Black, Asian, non-white, minority ethnic, to play Ciri in their adaptation of the beloved Polish fantasy series. I'm a little on the fence about this one, mainly because The Witcher already has an established look to the characters because of the video game. Further, when reading Sapkowski's books, I always pictured the elves as people of color, because, well, the books deal with the subject of racism and discrimination, with elves and other magical races being oppressed. Why not make the elves Tartar or Turkish? That would visually show the issues the book explores and fit with the history of Poland. I think a POC actress for Elf Ifne would work great as well. And no, I have no idea how to pronounce her name. Don't at me about that. I'm not against black characters in The Witcher, but I thought putting out a casting call for a BAME actress for Ciri was done by someone who didn't really read or understand The Witcher series or the themes it contained. While I don't buy the argument that The Witcher series is set in legit historical Poland, and so is all white, part of the story is Ciri's a princess. On the logistical side, a big part of the story is Ciri's bloodline, meaning if her ethnicity is changed, her parents should be the same ethnicity, along with the imposter Ciri when she goes on the run. If they cast her family and doppelganger appropriately, I'd be on board with an all-white Ciri. Still, I thought the massive subreddit devoted to hating on the idea was a total overreaction. I think it does point to Poland needing to deal with its own issues of race, which I think it needs to do without also dealing with the US's baggage. Especially when the argument about dreadlocks being off limits boils down to race. It's not Jamaicans or Rastafarians or another group that is allowed to wear dreadlocks without criticism. It's only Africans or African Americans. To me, this is bringing race into the equation in a way that makes me really, really uncomfortable. For example, I can understand why religious symbols should only be used by one culture, particularly minority cultures. The practice of smudging, or burning sage, used in death cleansing rituals by some native tribes, is one. Unless you grew up in Ojibwe culture, buying a bundle of endangered plant species at Whole Foods is obnoxious. But the heart argument is not about culture or religion. It's about race. I think using race as a measure to someone's access to culture is a bad standard. For example, I have a student in one of my classes with parents from both Ukraine and Africa. I think the same Twitter posters from the beginning would look at her and decide it's okay for her to wear dreadlocks, despite the fact that this student grew up outside Africa. For a country like Poland, where many people have fled or immigrated over the centuries because of the partitioning, because of the world wars, because of communism, the issue of culture and national identity is blurry. A close friend of mine bemoans the fact that he speaks both English and Polish with a slight accent, as his family left Poland when he was still a teenager. I've met a number of Poles whose families moved to Canada and the US, then moved back, meaning they have relatives on both sides of the Atlantic as well as dual citizenship. I'm also concerned about the use of race because of the slippery slope back to nationalism and racism. Since living in Poland, I've been researching more about Slavic deities and pagans, and I was pretty horrified to discover that there is a modern Slavic pagan movement, but it's racist. The members believe that only true Slavic people get to take part. Foreigners are not welcome. While Americans might look at me and decide that I'm Polish enough, with my Polish ancestry, a Polish nationalist or Slavic native faith member would see me as a foreigner, my few pints of blood and heavily accented Polish not counting for nothing. Which is why the debate around dreadlocks bothers me. Culture is an identity. Race can be, but not always. The same logic that says white people can't wear dreadlocks also keeps me from taking part in Slavic pagan or Wiccan rituals. If the goal is to work towards a less racist society, getting tangled up in minutiae like this doesn't help. One of the Twitter posters about Tokarczuk's dreadlocks compared her with a Holocaust denier. I really think that if our goal is to make society less racist, there are larger, more systemic issues that we need to look at. Getting bogged down in shouting matches on social media only distracts from real issues and real activism. To me, people who criticize her dreadlocks are giving a shallow, drive-by critique of Polish culture. And if you get huffy about people expecting you to know details about some random country's culture like Poland, well, then why the hell do you expect the rest of the world to know the details about US culture? Our perspective isn't the only one that matters. I understand the question of cultural appropriation is not an easy one to answer. In some ways, that question reminds me of Tokarczuk's characters. While I identify with them, her characters are not always morally good people. The way her work indirectly looks at questions of morality is one I find compelling. She befriends genuine people dealing with situations in ways that are often very troubling, but very understandable. I find her work captivating as her prose is lyrical and her stories real. While living in Poland has made me understand a lot of the references in her work, what I love is how she can take distinct settings and situations in Poland and make them accessible at finding universal truths in them. All of us have different perspectives shaped by our different experiences and cultures, yet there are some universal feelings almost all of us share. Seeing experiences or feelings I've had in a different cultural setting is to realize how alike we are, even across different cultural backgrounds. Her novel, Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead, the book the film Polka was based on, features an anti-hero who takes on hunters and the church, which is pretty controversial in Poland. Janina, the novel's main character, was fairly eccentric. She lived in a remote mountain village, translated William Blake's poetry in English, made astrology charts for people she knew, and often discussed her troubles, her euphemism for her mental and physical health problems. However, after she won the Nobel, libraries here can't keep up with demand for Tokarczuk's books, causing conservative PIS members to try to keep up with the demand. I'm happy to see them putting politics away, at least for the moment. If Poland is going to change for the better, it needs more people like her. If you take away something from this video, I hope is to check out her books. Many of them, including Primeval and Other Times and House of Day, House of Night, have been translated into English. Maybe with the awards she's won, even more of her books will be translated into more languages. Thanks to Brianna Stallings, my script advisor, and Pavel Nabowski for Polish subtitles. And thanks to Jacek Bochenek for challenging me on this issue. If you enjoyed the video, maybe give me some nice comments to read, or give me some pretty analytics to look at by sharing the video.